Hello, everybody. My name is Andrew Kleiman. I'll be chairing today's roundtable discussion of one of the video panels, presentations, and commentary that Marxist-Humanist Initiative recently released. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, organized these panels, two panels, for this year's Left Forum conference, but the Left Forum was canceled because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so MHI has decided to forge ahead with its panels and publish them in video and audio form online. Let me just tell you a little about what MHI is. It aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist-Humanism articulated by Raya Dunevskaya. We're not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organizations and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous activities alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. So we seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. In this session, we'll be commenting on the video panel that we called Marxist-Humanist Perspectives on the Life and Death Battle Against Trumpism. The presenters were Jaclard, Adam Plante, and Ravi Bali. And with me on Skype today are members and friends of MHI, as well as most of the panelists. We'll be commenting on the presentations, asking questions, and engaging with one another. Because everybody on this call has watched the video of the panel, we won't take time trying to summarize it. We'll assume that everybody listening out there to our discussion has also watched the video. So if you haven't done so yet, I suggest that you do so first, go to the video, and then listen to our discussion today. And how do you get to the video? Well, you're probably either, listening to this audio on YouTube, and the link to the video is on our YouTube page or on the MHI site. You're listening to the audio on the MHI site, and the link to the video is also on the audio's MHI page. So we're going to begin by discussing Jaclard's presentation. I've been designated to be the discussant of her presentation, so I'll go first. I'll speak for up to 5 minutes. Then the floor is going to be open for discussion. And people who speak from the floor, they're also going to have up to 5 minutes each. I'll take a stack of 3 or 4 people, then let Anne reply to any questions she's been asked, and then repeat the process to the extent that time allows. And when we then discuss Adam Plante's presentation and Ravi Bali's presentation, we'll use the same procedure. Before we start, I do need to emphasize the opinions of the presenters, the discussants, and the participants that are going to follow in this discussion. These are their own opinions, not necessarily those of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. And I'm going to remind everybody who's on the call, as always, to ensure the best audio quality. It's essential that you mute yourself throughout the entire audio except when you are speaking. I'm going to begin, as I said, with comments on Jaclard's presentation, which she entitled Desperation is Driving the Trumpite Republican Party. Prepare for the worst. I think Anne's contribution was very good, and that the topic is extremely important. Every day there's just a lot of horrible, undemocratic stuff being perpetrated by Trump and his lackeys and the Republican Party generally. Brutalization of immigrants and asylum seekers, efforts to make it harder for people to vote, etc., etc. It just never ends. Anne's presentation gathered together and summarized a lot of these atrocities. But she's done also something that I think is more important. When you get led by the nose, following the news of the day, it might seem that what's going on is one damn thing after another. But Anne's presentation made it clear that these undemocratic moves aren't separate things. They're all of a piece. The presentation, I think, made this clear partly by bringing them all together, or at least brought together the main kinds of atrocities that are confronting us, and that allows us to see what they all have in common. But even more important than that, I think her presentation explained very cogently why all of these things are taking place. Not why this or that was taking place, but all of them. And it's not just that Trump and Republican politicians are evil and prejudiced and out to own the libs. I mean, that's all true. But Anne's presentation explains that there's a unified logic to all of this, a single underlying drive that is behind all of these atrocities. The drive is to hold on to power. The political power of Trump and the Republicans, and the class power of capital, at least as that's understood by their top donors. Okay, so they're trying to hold on to power, but it becomes harder and harder for them year after year to hold on to power by democratic means. Why? Because the core of Republican voters, non-Hispanic whites, they're shrinking as a share of the voting public. And there's little hope that blacks, Hispanics, and other people of color are going to turn toward the Republicans, certainly not after Trumpism. And I think Anne's presentation did a good job of summarizing the demographic trends and the key racial and ethnic differences in terms of voting behavior. If I have time, I'll point to a couple of facts that I'm generally aware of this stuff, but she brought out a couple of facts that I had not been aware of. If I have time, I'll talk about that. In any case, as Anne pointed out a few times, even though the demographics are against the Republican Party, it faced and still maybe faces a choice in how it tries to hold on to power. It could, in principle, try to broaden its appeal, especially by becoming less hardline about immigration. And that is, in fact, what top establishment Republicans wanted to do, and it's what the so-called Republican autopsy report urged that they do after their defeat in the 2012 presidential election. The problem is the base of the party, the racist and xenophobic white voters. They weren't having any of that. And they were, of course, egged on by Fox News, right-wing talk radio, and so forth. The base is what succeeded in elevating Trump over 16 more or less establishment Republican candidates in the 2016 primaries. And the base is what has turned the Republican Party decisively into a straight, flat, racist, xenophobic Trumpite party. And so, given the demographic trends and together with the voting power of the Trumpite base, those two things together leave the Republicans with only one option in their effort to retain power, which is to undermine democracy. That's the key takeaway, I think, from Anne's presentation. And I think she's quite right. And I think one of the most significant features of her presentation was her discussion of the fact that, according to people who are in the know, insiders, the Republicans are well aware that they're undermining democracy, and they're okay with undermining democracy as a way of holding on to power. There's an inexorable drive to undermine democracy in the U.S. Its ultimate limit is, as Anne points out, apartheid. Elimination of voting rights and possibly protections of citizenship of people of color. Will Trumpism have the scruples to stop short of that? Does Trump have scruples that make him stop short of anything? As Anne warns, we have to prepare for the worst. And I think we have to fight it hard, and we have to fight it in a way that recognizes it as what it is. We're not dealing with political issues here about which reasonable people can differ. We're dealing ultimately with a large mass base of people who are threatening our lives and well-being, either purposely or because of willful indifference. Okay, the floor is now open for discussion. I'll take 3 or 4 people in a stack. If you'd like to speak, please say your name.
Brendan.
Okay. Brendan? Would anybody like to go after Brendan?
Adam.
Adam? Would anybody like to go after Adam? Floyd. Okay, so let's start with Brendan, Adam. Floyd, take it away, Brendan.
Okay. Great paper by Ann. I think it really distills a lot of the essential political questions that we're dealing with right now in the States. The crisis is escalating so rapidly here in the U.S., coming to such a head that it's quite frightening. And I'm glad that I think all the papers. Let me just say this ahead of time. I think all the papers on this panel were really excellent, and I'm really glad that even though we planned this panel back in the early part of this year, before the coronavirus had even sort of shown up in the States, that we were able to still deliver a really relevant panel. The escalation of the political crisis in the States right now is so drastic that we were seeing like efforts to sabotage, destroy the post office, the postal system, just to steal the election. I'm very suspicious that the withholding of direct payments to people on unemployment assistance is perhaps a ploy by the Republicans for more people to get evicted so they can't vote by mail or vote at all because they don't have an address anymore. It's the sending police into Portland may have been just a warm up for martial law in different places, deployment by ICE and other forces to intimidate people from voting. But then in the larger sense, I feel like this entire phenomenon of Trumpism is like a warm up for and the way that Trump has tried to handle this pandemic is like a warm up for the much larger issues of refugees, social dislocation, changes of racial and cultural demographics that are going to happen in the very near future because of climate change. And if we're not able as a society to orient ourselves around basic principles of rule of law, liberal democracy, now in the face of Trumpism, I don't know how we're going to deal with the massive political crisis that we're going to be facing in the near future with the disruptions brought on by climate change. Over.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. Adam?
Yeah, I think Brendan really hits the nail on the head with his last comment that if we can't get our shit together and rescue democracy now, how are we going to fare when, issues like climate change or nuclear proliferation or, the complete, corruption of the information ecosystem, start to really develop in the coming decades. Just going back for a moment, though, one of the key features of democracy, of liberal democracy, is that opposition is internal. That within the government, there can be an opposition to the government. What I mean by that is, of course, in Parliament or in Congress, there's an opposition party which is still part of the government, still part of the decision-making process, even though they're the opposition. And this is one of the key features of liberal democracy, which can also be exploited to undermine it from within. And it's clear that this is what the Republicans have in mind. One final point, the statistic that whites are going to be a minority of the population in the mid-2040s really stood out to me because there are platforms and places where whites are already the minority. For instance, in 2014, white students became the minority in public schools, or at least they were no longer the majority, rather. And this is a really, staggering pace at which this was accelerating. So in 2000, 38.8% of students were minorities, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific, etc. And just 14 years later, they were 50.3%. And I think there's a lot of other trends that we can look at, demographic trends that we can look at to help illuminate right-wing behavior and policy making in these fronts. For example, the increased privatization of public schooling, through less overt means such as charter schools. But I really want to reflect on the import of why, I think that the lasting effects of Trumpism are really one of the key points of this paper. The demographic trends are not going away anytime soon, barring something really drastic like completely halting immigration to this country, or much worse, as Anne details in the paper. And what this means is that Trumpism isn't going anywhere. It's very clear, I mentioned this in the discussion period, it's very clear that the Republicans have chosen not to, try to appeal to more conservative immigrant and children of immigrant populations. For example, such as Roman Catholicism in South American immigrants and so on. So what's the alternative here? Well, the alternative is increasingly horrific as time goes on. The fertility rates in whites are dropping, whereas the fertility rates in immigrants are rising. So this is a long-term trend that merely stopping immigration won't be able to, won't be able to stop. It's going to be deportations or worse. And so the lasting threat of Trumpism is, I think, one of the real takeaways of this paper is, merely getting Trump out of office, merely, resuscitating liberal democracy is not enough, because we have a large faction of the right which has chosen to not only jettison democracy, but has chosen a very, very violent path of response to these demographic changes.
1 minute.
And I think, thank you. And I think it's really important that we reflect on that, because, even if, draconian immigration policies were implemented, these demographic trends will continue, and the political consequences of that, given the clear choice that the right has made, is really astounding. Over.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Floyd?
Thank you. Just very, very quickly, I hope. Basically, as we've seen with regards to Portland, which, as has been mentioned, might well be a test case, but not just Portland, other places with regards to those cities virtually facing an invasion by federal forces. Zoom forward to November, and if it is a case of Joe Biden winning the election, I was just wondering as to what would happen if Trump says, well, I don't accept this, especially given the fact that certainly a number of people in the federal administration seem to be very ambivalent with regards to resisting him. Would we be looking at effectively, I don't know, a coup or a proto-fascist state emerging from that? Over.
Okay, thanks, Floyd. I don't think Anne received any direct questions to her, but Anne, would you like to comment? We can take one more comment and then turn to you.
I had a quick question.
Yes, Davis.
Yeah, just a question about this. I hear this demographic shift all the time on the right. It's become a real sticking point for them, and I was wondering I've always kind of grappled. How do you discuss this with them? And is it worth discussing with right-wingers, or is it worth discussing with leftists about how to address this demographic shift? And that's just what I wanted to ask. Over.
I have a quick question, too.
Is that Mike?
Yes.
Okay, be very quick, please.
Yeah, the line that I zeroed in on is on page 10. We face both long-term and immediate struggles if we are to defeat Trump and Trumpism. I say Trumpism because our greatest threat is that Trumpism is here to stay. Would you say that a precondition for defeating Trumpism is abolishing the entire bourgeois electoral system in 2020? Or is it possible that the Republicans will go back to, because they'll be so thoroughly defeated, that they'll go back to that postmortem from 2012 and make other swarthy quote unquote Europeans became white? Will that be picked back up again and try to make Latinx people white or other demographics white and sort of go into that kind of compassionate conservatism again? Is that even possible?
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Mike. Anne, you got 2 questions to deal with. And you can say whatever else you want to say as well.
I have impossible questions here. Floyd wants to know what'll happen if Trump refuses to go after he loses. Will there be a coup? What? I don't know, but we should certainly be prepared to have to write, flyer, march, throw our bodies on the line, whatever, to try to save the country. Davis, I didn't understand your question. You say the right as well as the left is talking about this demographic shift, and how do you address it? Well, I don't think we address it. It just is. I would think that the, quote, compassionate conservatives would be advocating a reform of the Republican Party for the future, that it begin appealing to the non-whites instead of shunning them. And that would mean that it has to uproot Trumpism. But they've got a long way to go because Trumpism has completely taken over the party. Any decent Republican has left it, and is operating from outside the party in opposition to it. So I don't know. Is it the end of the 2-party system? Is there no future except a civil war between the right-wing fascistic types and everyone else? I can't foretell, but we better be ready for anything, because it could happen, as Floyd points out, as soon as November. And Davis, you have to tell me, if there's time, what you meant about how do we address it. We've said our piece. Am I supposed to say more than this? Or is someone else going to speak, or what? I don't know.
No, we don't have time for another person. So if you want to make a brief final comment, do. Otherwise, we're going to move to the discussion of the next presentation.
No, I just will agree that it's dizzying the speed with which Trump is trying new things. He has, he's ruining the post office. He's tried to float the idea of postponing the election. Every day there's some other crisis that he cites. And there's sure to be more in the next few weeks before the election, because he has to manufacture distractions from the coronavirus and from the economic destitute. Distress is going to get so bad when the money stops, if it hasn't already. It has stopped, but the question is, will they start up the aid again or not, or only a little bit of it? So anything could happen in the immediate future, including that old chestnut, you start a war. And I think Trump is looking every day for where can he start a war. So, I mean, he was very happy, I think, I don't know, about the horrific explosion in Beirut that killed so many and left so many homeless. Whereas anyone in their right mind would say, oh my God, this shows how horrible capitalism is, that they allowed this dangerous chemical to sit in a warehouse in the middle of a major city for so long until it blew up. But the Republicans think that's fine. I mean, there was an explosion in Texas a few years ago, at a chemical storage facility.
Yeah, and I have to wrap up.
Oh, okay. I won't say any more. I don't know what's going to happen, but watch this space for what MHI figures out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to move to a discussion of the second presentation. The overall title of the panel is Marxist-Humanist Perspectives on the Life and Death Battle Against Trumpism. The second presenter was Adam Plante. His presentation was entitled When Left is Right, when left is rightist. Left-wing reactionaries bolster Trumpist threat. When left is rightist. Left-wing reactionaries bolster Trumpist threat. That's right. So let's hear first from our designated discussant, who is Anne Jaclard. You've got 5 minutes, Anne.
Okay, it's me again. And Adam's and paper and mine are very complementary in the same of a piece in what the danger is and how serious it is from Trumpism's assault on democracy and particularly on voting rights as I discuss it. But I want to say in general, Adam's paper shows his evolution over several months that he's been writing on the topic of defending democracy. And particularly he talks about the so-called leftists who bolster Trumpism with their reactionary views. And this analysis doesn't come out of nowhere, however. It's actually, I would say, a further development, a new stage, as it were, in Marxist-Humanist thinking that has been a major theme over the 11 years of our existence, that is critiquing the left, so-called left, as I call it. My only real quibble with his paper is where he says, quote, there's a style of politics on the left which is aloof to the threat which the global ascendancy of the far right poses, not only to the socialist project, but to humanity. Well, this is quite a statement of the threat to humanity. So what I object to is the word style of politics. I don't think it's a style of politics. I think it's the essence of the politics. And I want to explain that a little bit in the statement I just made, that it's a further development of our analysis of a segment of the left that's killing us all these years. To call it style of politics is too weak. It's part of this life and death struggle against Trumpism, pre-Trumpism and post-Trump Trumpism. And it's the content of the politics, and that is derived, I think, ultimately from certain attitude toward the masses of people. We've written about the underlying attitude of a segment of the left toward the masses as backward, considering them backward, needing to be led by a vanguard, whether it's a party or a part of the capitalist class organized some way, or whether it's a workers' dictator. Speaking of Proudhon, it's an attitude that ordinary people are incapable of organizing themselves, of making a revolution or building a new society. This leads to the elitist orientation of that segment of the left's actions, whether it's their forms of organization or the recent left-first programs. Adam discusses and defines this left-first, which says that everything is sacrificed to building my little party or my little faction of the Democratic Party because we're going to take over and that'll solve everything. So this in turn led to this segment of the left being soft on Trump because their larger concern to take over the Democratic Party or build their own party, take it over, trumped everything else. For longer than the past 4 years, MHR's emphasis has been on stopping and uprooting Trumpism. In our articles warning about Trumpism, even before the election, we've been slamming this part of the so-called left. I'm saying slamming because critiquing doesn't connote the urgency and total rejection of it that we need. And we've been warning of the extraordinary dangers that Trump opposes. Everything we said over the past 4 years has come true, every dire prediction and much more. We wish that this segment of the left would admit their error and say, yes, you were right, we were wrong, we're going to change our ways. I think some of them have, because we don't hear from them anymore. But others are now repeating this attitude with certain lines. Thank God they're not running third-party candidates. But there is apparently a large segment talking about abstentionism, that is, just don't vote. Adam attempts to spell out the positive in liberal democracy, not just what we would lose if we lost democratic rights, but the fact that you can't even talk about revolution and Marx and socialism without having those rights, and then the positive in which he's backed by Marx, Engels, and Lenin, all of whom he quotes, as they consider democracy's role as a platform from which to fight for socialism. I'll end there.
Okay, thank you, Anne. The floor is now open for open discussion. Again, I'll take 3 or 4 people on the stack. Who would like the floor?
Floyd.
Okay, I heard Floyd. Is there anybody else in particular, anybody else who has not yet spoken in this discussion?
Eric.
Anybody else? Okay, since Eric has not yet spoken, I want to call first on Eric, and he'll be followed by Floyd. Take it away, Eric, please.
Oh, okay. I had spoken oh no, I haven't spoken yet. Okay, just briefly, it's just a question really, which was, like some of these arguments, I've recently having some of these arguments, on social media with people, and people are just, on the left, and they're very, very stuck in their ways. They don't, originally, like, for example, I had I intervened in where some people were discussing about a group called, what was it? There's a group campaign, and they run a campaign called Resist Fascism, and they were basically saying, well, ho ho, isn't it funny that this group is basically by telling people to vote for Biden, that they've capitulated to the this whole thing, their campaign about resisting fascism. And I was pointing out some of the things that we've been talking about since we did our perspectives in 2018 about the extraordinary threat that Trump poses, and it's saying that it's even more apparent now. And these people just booted me out of the forum, and that was the end of that. It's like people aren't, and I had another discussion with somebody who's a left communist, and exactly the same reaction. I was accused of democratic shaming, which whatever that means. But the point is, I'll be really interested in how people find arguing with the rest of the left on this, on these issues. if anybody had anything interesting to say about it. Over.
Thanks, Eric. Floyd?
Thanks. Eric, it sounds like you were cancelled, unfortunately, a number of times. But with regards to my point, I mean, Adam did mention, with regards to the style of politics thing, which is allude to the threat, which a global sensitivity of the far right poses. And again, just to echo what Eric was, what wasn't saying, especially in regards to a potential abstentionism. In the run-up to the general election here in the UK last year, there were a number of people calling, basically saying, that there was no point in, voting. And then when the Tories got in, a lot of people being demoralised, and those people who had argued for abstention were more or less crowing over what they saw as their victory. But in terms of the people, that might abstain, especially, with regards to elections in November and also here in terms of ongoing politics, I think that many on the left see democracy as being hijacked, as they would see it, by big money. In terms of fact that it costs a lot, to do mainstream bourgeois politics, and so that, if you like, provides the excuse for abstention or indeed for voting for third parties. Obviously, that will have a wider consequence in the USA, certainly, especially when it comes to abstentionism. But I mean, like I said, certainly a number of people do see, and this is irony, their abstentionism as being a democratic means of expressing their displeasure at, as they see it, the game being rigged. Over.
Thank you, Floyd. Would one or two other people like to comment from the floor?
Van?
Davis.
Mike?
Van and Davis and Mike. Oh my. Oh my.
I'll be short, Andrew.
Okay. Van, go ahead, and then Davis, and then maybe Mike if we have time.
I just want to thank both Anne and Adam for their presentations. And when I read them both, I got a feeling of what Gramsci called the pessimism of the intellect, that things are really bad and they're going to get worse. But the more I think about it and the more I considered their themes, there's also the formula in Gramsci of the optimism of the will. And it's a mistake for us just to dwell on protection and defense. That's clearly what we have to do of so-called bourgeois rights, right to vote, right to assembly, right to speech, free speech, and so on. But one of the interesting things about Adam's presentation in particular, in addition to Anne's, is that in doing so, in protecting and defending, we're also providing an opening, a breathing room. There are various analogies that can be used for the self-development of the masses. The answer is not simply just voting for a Democrat. The answer is not just simply saying we've got to get rid of Trump. That's clear. But if we don't do these things to protect what we already have, we don't have the opening for the self-development of the masses to carry the struggle forward to end the capitalist system. Over.
Okay, thanks, Van. And Davis?
Yeah, I'll try to make it short. Just Eric mentioned talking to other leftists in the response to abstentionism or voting or whatever. Usually I haven't heard anything cogent, but just in my experience, the common threads are things like you're legitimizing, quote unquote, the system. It's getting in the way of class conflict. All this kind of stuff. It's just it's somehow hurting the ability for revolution, and that's my experience, just in what limited ways I have that. Over.
Okay, that was indeed short. Mike, we have time for a short comment.
Yeah, I just want to say, I guess my just immediate reaction in terms of the question of how we relate to the left. I mean, there's a tension there because we are trying to stay away from it being about personal candidates, right? With Biden, for example, and the way that the left is relating to Biden is varied, but also, like, for example, there's a meeting coming up. How will Me Too survive the election, right? And sort of putting Biden and Trump on a level of, these are both, sexual abusers, right? And we believe Tara Reid and such. I think that relating to a personal candidate in terms of Biden and relating to Trump in terms of what Trumpism is, what kind of forces are being unleashed, and what some of the papers that we've been speaking about today has articulated. Those are two different things. Keeping it in terms of like what an actual candidate. Yeah, we're not voting to get Biden and what his remarkable policies are. We're voting for a temporary or a defeat, not of Trumpism in total, but of Trump and what he represents, right in November. I'm not sure if that's clear or not, but that is a tension, and it's something that I think I've been running up against online.
I'm going to call on myself for just a couple of brief remarks. One, I think Van went beyond the optimism of the will. I really hate that expression, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, because if you care about achieving results, the grounds of your optimism can't be just sheer will. It has to be grounded in reality. So I would say we need realism of the intellect, and we need realism of political action. But in terms of these people who call themselves left and how do we relate to them, I think this is much less of a problem than it was prior to the uprising for Black Lives and the Democratic primary campaign in this country. I think these people have been, as we put it in the Brendan and I in the Radio Free Humanity podcast, they've been consigned to the dustbin, the Jacko dustbin of history. I think the real left, at least in the United States, has totally passed them by and is on an entirely different wavelength. And they're going to sooner or later, bit by bit, catch up and try to be out in front of the movement once again on some new basis. But what we're really dealing with in all these cases is a species of left-first politics and just denigrating anything that, they can't control. And I just wouldn't take it that seriously or at face value or like it's anything other than petty politics. Okay, I think we've got time for one. No, I think we should turn to Adam if he wishes to respond to anything and to make concluding comments.
How long do I have?
You got 3 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, a couple of things. First, to respond to Eric, I believe he was referring to the group Refuse Fascism, which is a front group for the Revolutionary Communist Party. And recently, that party came out and actually, I believe it was as strong as endorsing Biden. And when Bob Avakian is endorsing Biden, that shit has hit the fan. They're usually proud of their abstentionism. And, since I started writing about this about a year and a half ago, it's been really illuminating to see how some of the political, especially in the last couple of months, just how much some people on the left have shifted, that now even Zizek, who I critique in the paper, even Zizek has come out and said that you need to vote for Biden over Trump. So that, it's been interesting to see how things have adjusted given that Trump has become so odious that even portions of the left which were previously agnostic to him have reconfigured. Just on the point that Andrew was talking about how there's a portion of the left that denigrates anything they can't control. I think there's a certain two-facedness, because on the one hand, when Bernie's still in the running, this portion of the left is perfectly fine with pretending that bourgeois politicking is the way to go and that's the way forward. But as soon as their platform is defeated or they can't get the concessions that they need, or their candidate has to drop out, they immediately turn to denigrating it, and they move to third party rhetoric or like pretending that they can keep their hands clean by voting for Jill Stein or somebody, or they just flat out move to abstentionism. And I just think that there's a real two-facedness there. Also on that point, I also see a lot of rhetoric that, both sides are the same. The Republicans are just as bad as the Democrats. Biden's actually, to the right of Trump on certain issues. And then, they cite a whole host of issues like, the criminal justice reform and so on. But I think that this oversimplifies conflict within the ruling class. And I think Anne has done a good job of developing some of these ideas that there is real conflict within the ruling class. There is real jockeying for political power. And I think it does a disservice to class analysis to really oversimplify that. And then finally, briefly, it's been really interesting to write about Marx and Lenin's view of bourgeois democracy because of the time at which they're writing. They're writing under authoritarian governments and pre-democratic or pre-liberal democratic governments, and it's been really illuminating to really understanding their position to work through their thinking and not simply take their conclusions as given, but work through their reasoning and see what the underlying principles are there, the underlying analysis is, and apply it to different situations and try to develop it in different circumstances. Over.
Okay, thank you. I was just about to tell you needed to wrap up, but you did. Okay, so that concludes our discussion of Adam Plante's presentation. In this panel, Marxist-Humanist Perspectives on the Life and Death Battle Against Trumpism. The third and final presenter was Ravi Bali, who spoke on Trumpism, Labourism, and Nationalism. And we're going to hear first from our designated discussant, Floyd Whitman.
Thank you. Just trying to find, the first page now. I think what Ravi was able to do was able to do a very good distillation of the reactionary trend that has taken place within UK politics, especially with regards to race. Obviously, a lot of this dated, COVID. I would say it goes back to 2016, when in the UK here we had the referendum on whether to stay or to leave the European Union, and certainly that has brought out the reactionaries, and they're not all by any means on the right, as one would otherwise expect. As it relates to COVID, again, it just seems that each era has to find a scapegoat, and Ravi points to the fact that in this instance, certainly in the early stages of COVID developing here in the UK, the Chinese community came under severe attack, with several people within the Tory party deciding to echo Trump in order to claim that the Chinese were behind it all. And it did put me in mind of in the 20s and 30s, the propaganda campaign here, and I think maybe in the USA, the yellow peril argument, which was basically a campaign against people from Southeast Asia. Going on to Brexit, then again, Ravi points out that one of the consequences of it was, if you like, the racialization of whether to stay or leave the, EU. And I think he points to, again, quite well, the way in which it has become synonymous with chauvinism and nationalism. And again, the left can't escape that gaze, because unfortunately there were people on the left who gave, if you like, tacit support to figures on the right who were pro Brexit. He also mentions obviously about the Labour Party and the role that it's played historically, but he also mentions Black Lives Matter and how that has been a welcome development in terms of a potential means of countering the racist narrative here in the UK. And I think, again, this has really shook people in the establishment on the right, but also on the left, because we've got an organisation that, while it might have, and again I'm using it in its broadest term, a leftist outlook, it nonetheless doesn't feel that it owes the left in general, in terms of the small partners on the left and the Labour Party in particular, any sort of favours. And I think for many that's been quite disorientating, but it's also a welcome development as well, because it's put the issue of racial justice at its heart in terms of in terms of its development. But obviously, where that goes from there, I think will be an interesting question. Both Ravi, Eric, and I have been on various BLM protests over the last few months, and what we've noticed is that the organised left has largely been absent, and it's also been a situation where they haven't been able to take it over, as might have happened in the past. And so, again, I see that as a welcome development. Ravi does end by saying the takeoff of the BLM movement in the UK represents a new element that is outside not only traditional mainstream politics, but also radical left politics too. It is internationalist in its concerns, anti-racist in its orientation, pro-LGBTQ in its platform, initiated by women, supported by youth, and has attacked the very roots of British self-identity, leaving many uncomfortable. It is a very promising start, and I think I would definitely echo that based on my experiences and I suspect Eric's as well. Over.
Okay, thank you, Floyd. The floor is now open for discussion. Who would like the floor?
Eric.
Eric would like the floor. Anybody else? Any Yankee? Okay, so we'll hear from Eric, and then maybe somebody else will want to come in.
Okay, hi. All right, so so Ravi did take us, in his paper, take us through basically a history of of racism in basically, especially in the UK. One of the things I've noticed since the Black Lives Matter the Black Lives Matter movement has exploded over here is that I've often found that there seems to be a lot of incomprehension that racism even exists in Britain at all. And what I found really interesting is that part of the narrative over Brexit was that those leaving the EU were not racist. That was one of the things that kept getting repeated, and that Brexit would be fairer to non-EU immigrants because of a new points-based system. And generally, there was this attitude in Britain that, isn't race relations better than in other EU countries and in the EU and the US anyway? So so the idea that racism was here is like, what are people talking about? Some people even argue that racism no longer exists because of the culture, laws, and general unacceptability of racism. A good example is that a philosophy group I recently attended argued that because race was an unscientific term, it did not exist, and therefore talking about it from an anti-racist point of view was the same as reinforcing the racist point of view. Bizarrely, that's the argument that they were using. So I basically pointed out that that younger people in large numbers seem much more clued into what the Black Lives Movement was about and about racism than a lot of older people, even older anti-racists. So, for example, whereas years ago in Britain, anti-racism used to be driven by blaming far-right groups, quite prejudiced people, and institutional racism. The movement now is busily fleshing out actually what racism is, how systemic it is, and this movement is being powered by the acceptance of and trying to understand the direct experiences of people living in a racist society, which I think is something quite new, that younger people are really willing to accept, listening to people's experiences, or black people's experiences and people of colour's experiences. Black Lives Matter has a term which they always use, global anti-blackness, that they want to see the back of. And I really like that term, they want to get rid of global anti-blackness. And this, for me, captures some of the internationalist spirit that in one slogan that Ravi was talking about. Over.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Would anybody else like the floor?
Floyd.
Floyd. Okay, so yeah, let's hear from Anne, who hasn't spoken on this contribution. Would anybody like to go after Anne?
Brendan?
Brendan? Okay, so Anne and then Brendan, and if there's time, Floyd. Okay, go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, just a Yankee point of view a little bit. I'm always surprised when I hear people say, well, there's not that much racism in the UK. They don't kill that many, police don't kill that many black people. They don't all have guns or something. But it's not a relative question. It's a question of, is there systemic racism, and how can we uproot it? And just from the article that we have on our website journal, on the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK, you can see all the issues that the movement has raised that are not just about police brutality, and are not just about formal racism, laws or something, but about education, how that's such a grounds for instilling or uprooting racism, who you teach about, who you have statues to, because the people who funded the English people who helped fund the Civil War and slavery, their statues are coming down over there. So there's a real cross-Atlantic discussion, and the issues are cross-Atlantic, and if you include the Caribbean and Africa, it becomes global, and I think it's tremendous. I can't remember my other point. Over.
Okay, Brendan?
I'm really glad that there was able to be a discussion of the George Floyd protest, the Black Lives Matter stuff in this panel. And I think that there's something about the movement that's very germane to the discussion we were just having after Adam's paper, talking about Ann's paper discussing the struggle against Trumpism and authoritarianism, and this issue of parts of the left who have a hard time wanting to vote against Trump because it's going to dirty themselves make them, that messed up their left bona fides. The Black Lives Matter movement has done so much for the struggle against Trumpism in this country. It's completely changed the conversation around race in America within a space of a few weeks, and has taken Trump's biggest ammo out of his arsenal. I mean, he was planning to win this election by playing the race card, and that's becoming less and less possible for him. Polling has shown very consistently across the board that these kind of nativist appeals are not having enough of an impact to boost his polling, and that's why he's having to resort to naked authoritarianism. So that's one of the points I wanted to just mention about these protests, is that they really have they've done more than I thought would have been possible to turn the tables on Trump. But they also at the same time are, they're not confined to the sphere of electoral politics at all. They are about a different issue, about policing in America and about racism that goes well beyond electoral politics. And I think that's another thing that some people on the left have a hard time understanding, how a movement can sort of be somewhat leaderless and powerful and have a major effect on the politics, but also not be confined to or solely about electoral politics, and to have a dynamic that's greater than that. I think it's hard for some people to wrap their minds around because it's not part of the way they understand movements and politics. But it's there for anyone to see if they don't have those kind of preconceived ideas about movements. Over.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. Has anybody who's not spoken in this segment wished the floor? Okay, let's see. I need to see how much time we have. Okay, we've got a few minutes. Unfortunately, Ravi, who was the presenter, he can't be here today. So we have a few minutes for others to discuss. I know Floyd wanted the floor, and I'll say something briefly if there's time remaining. So take it away, Floyd.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm just going to. Here in the UK, there has, ironically enough, been a bit of a liberal backlash in terms of a number of people who consider themselves liberal in both the media and also politics have been trying to step away from the minimal that they were doing to fight, racism, mainly because the people around Black Lives Matters are making their own decisions and not giving a nod or not, if you like, allowing liberals to dictate their politics or their direction. And I've noticed on social media, at least, and possibly more, wider, the slogan "All Lives Matter." Now, obviously, that's rooted in an attempt to deny people of colour both agency and also, if you like, to try to downplay the idea of racism. But I'm just wondering whether comrades in the US had also experienced that. Over.
Okay, I'll say something brief. I think one of the important things in Ravi's presentation was very near the end, and he said, what has become clear is that the social democracy of Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn in this more polarized atmosphere is just not going to cut it. When there is a politics of xenophobic nationalism, as represented by Trump in the U.S. and in a seemingly milder form of Brexit here in the UK, a modest redistributionist politics, such as Sanders and Corbyn put forward, is not a real alternative. The economic populism of offering something to everyone, however desirable it might seem to those who buy into that vision, does not seem a credible offering to most people. And I think that that's right, and it's not just Ravi and it's not just people in MHI who are saying this. Somebody turned me on to an article by a Labour Party supporter, who was supportive of Corbyn in the UK. Her name is Rachel Shabi, or perhaps Rachel Shabi. And right after the decimation of Labour in the elections late last year, she said something very similar. Labour wanted to shift the conversation onto economic ground, creating a different us versus them, not Little England versus everybody else, a different us versus them by pitting the billionaire few who benefit from the current financial system against the many who don't. But the trouble is that this focus on class inequalities could not find sufficient purchase in a political conversation already saturated with right-wing antagonisms. As Labour found out to its cost, if the left does not challenge and dismantle such nativist forces, it risks getting bulldozed by them instead. So I think that there is, among people who are taking this stuff seriously and trying to reflect on it soberly and not just scoring political points, I think there is a growing recognition that this so-called class politics, this basically colorblind social democratic politics is not up to the present moment, and that there really needs to be a frontal attack against racism and xenophobia and so forth. And then we can talk about how you're not going to solve any class questions at all unless you deal with these racial and ethnic and national divisions. But at least we've got some recognition out there, and I think that's to the good. Does anybody want to make a short final remark before we wrap up?
Eric?
Okay. Anybody who has not spoken on this? Okay, Eric, please be brief, but go ahead.
Yeah, just very brief. I'm following on from what you were saying about the Labour Party's policies not being prepared. I was going to say my friend who organises the philosophy class I was talking about, who basically says that racism doesn't exist. His take was to straight away advertise for people, to say where people should be at is, going down to a picket line and supporting some workers on a picket line, not discussing non-existent racism. So I thought that's an example of what you're saying about the social democratic politics. Straight away, but because he's quite young, I think he thinks he's discovered something very new. But in fact, it's that old type of labourist politics which avoids talking about issues of race and gender, but in favour of talking about trade unionism. Over.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And that really brings us to the end of this audio discussion of the video panel, which again we called Marxist-Humanist Perspectives on the Life and Death Battle Against Trumpism. So I wish to thank everybody who's been on this Skype call, and of course the panelists, and thanks to everybody who's been listening in. For those who are listening in, we invite you to continue the discussion with us, Marxist-Humanist Initiative. So what we would ask you to do is to please post your comments on MHI's website. So how do you do that? Well, if you got to this audio from our site, just post your comment at the bottom of the page you visited. And everybody else can find the link to that page on MHI's site because there's a URL on this audio recording's YouTube page. And I've been urging before you listen to this audio that you check out the video that we're commenting on and the video presentations. You can also find the link to them on either place. This audio's page on the MHI website or this audio's page on YouTube. So thanks once again and goodbye.